Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We are from Group 13. Today we are going to explain about beyond tasks, alternative in assessment, grading, and students evaluation. Before we start our explanation, I would like to introduce our member. First, me, Puspita Yudaningrum, Muhammad Al-Kamilah, and Pak Nurdin. Let's move to the first topic, beyond tasks, alternative in assessment. Characteristics of alternative in assessment. First, they require students to perform, create, produce, or do something. Use real-world context or stimulus. Not instructive in the extent the day-to-day classroom activities. Allow students to be assessed on what they normally do in class. Use tasks that represent meaningful instructional activities. Focus on process as well as product, and tap into higher level thinking and problem solving skills. Dilemma in standardized and alternative in assessment. Formal standardized tests are almost by definition highly practical, reliable instruments. They are designed to minimize time and money to be part of the test designer and test taker, and to be painstaking in their scoring. Alternatives such as portfolio or conferencing with students on draft or written work, or observation of learner over time all require considerable time and effort on the part of the teacher and the students. But the alternative technique also offer markedly greater watchback, are superior formative measure, and because of their authenticity usually carry greater face validity. Performance-based assessment. Performance-based assessment implies productive, observable skills such as speaking and writing of content-valid tasks. Such performance usually, but always, bring with it all air of authenticity, real-world tasks that students have had time to develop. It often implies an integration of language skills, perhaps all four skills in the case of project work. The characteristic of performance assessment. Students make a constructive response. They engage in higher order thinking with open-engaged tasks. They are meaningful, engaged, and authentic. Tasks call for the integration of language skill. Both process and product are assessed. Depth of the student's mastery and emphasis over brand. Procedure for performance-based assessment. Performance-based assessment procedures need to be treated with the same rigor as traditional tests. This implies that teachers should state the overall goal of the performance, specify the objective of the performance in detail, prepare students for performance in stepwise progression, use a reliable evaluation form, checklist, or rating sheet, treat performance as opportunities for giving feedback and provide that feedback systematically. If possible, utilize self and peer assessment. Portfolio. A portfolio is a powerful collection of students' work that demonstrates students' effort, progress, and achievement in given area. Portfolio include materials such as essay and compositions in draft and final form, report, project outline, audio or video recording of presentation, demonstration, and something like that, journal, diaries, and other personal reflections, test score, and written homework exercise, self and peer assessment comments, evaluation, and checklists. Attributes of portfolio. There are 6 possible attributes of a portfolio: collecting, reflecting, assessing, documenting, linking, and evaluating. Step and guideline. State objective clearly. Give guidelines on what materials to include, communicate assessment criteria to students, design time with the curriculum for portfolio development, establish periodic schedule for review and conferencing, design an accessible place to keep portfolio, Provide positive watchback when giving final assessment. Journal. A journal is a log of one's thought, feeling, reflection, assessments, ideas, or progress toward goals, usually written with title attention to structure, form, or correctness. Journal obviously serve important pedagogical purposes. Step 4 Journal sensitively introduce students to the concept of journal writing, state the objective of the journal, give guidelines on what kind of topics to include, carefully specify the criteria of assessing or grading journals, provide optimal feedback in your response, design appropriate time frames and schedule for review, and provide formative washback giving final comments. Conferences and interviews. Conferences are not limited to draft or written word. It must assume that the teacher played the role of the facilitator and guider, not of as an administrator of a formal assessment. Guideline for performance guideline for conferences and interview. Over an initial atmosphere of warmth and anxiety lower. Begin with alternative simple question. Continue with level check and probe question. Frame question simply and directly. Focus on only one factor of each question. Be prepared to repeat or reframe questions which are not understood, and wind down with friendly and reassuring dozens comments. Observation. Observation is a systematic, planned procedure for real-time, almost furtive recording of students' verbal and non-verbal behavior. Potential observation focus. Sentence level oral prediction skills. Pronunciation of target sounds, intonation, and etc. Grammatical features, discourse level skills, interaction with classmates, and frequency of students' initiated response. Step 4 Observation. Determine the specific objective of the observation. Decide how many students will be observed at one time. Set up the logistic for making unnoticed observation. Design a system for recording observed performance. Do not over waste time. The number of different elements you can observe at one time. Plan how many observations you will make and determine specifically how you will use the result. Alternative in observation. Checklists are a viable alternative for recording observation results. Self and peer assessment. Peer assessment applies to similar principle, the most obvious with which is cooperative learning. Type of self and peer assessment. Assessment of a specific performance, indirect assessment of general competence, metacognitive assessment for setting goals, socio-alternative assessment, students' generated tests. Guideline for self and peer assessment. Tell students the process of the assessment, define the tasks clearly, encourage impartial evaluation of performance or ability, ensure beneficial feedback through follow-up tasks. A taxonomy of self and peer assessment tasks. Listening tasks. Listen to TV or radio broadcasts and checklist comprehension with a partner. Listening to an academic lecture and checking yourself off on a quiz of context. Speaking tasks. Using peer checklists and questionnaire. Rating someone's oral presentation. reading text, reading passage with self-check comprehension question following, taking vocabulary quiz, writing tasks, revising written work on your own with partner or with peer, and then proofreading. That's all my explanation. The next matter will be explained by Al-Kamila. For Al-Kamila, time is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I will try to continue the presentations. Well, these presentations will be delivered by me about grading and student evaluations. The first one is about philosophy of grading. What should grades reflect? One of the arguments for considering alternatives in assessment is that we may not be able to capture the totality of student competence through the formal tests. Other observations are also significant indicators of the ability. Nor should we discount most teacher intuitions, which enables them to form impressions of the student that cannot easily be verified empirically. This argument tells us that improvement, behavior, effort, motivations, attendance might just be able to set up components that add up to the final grade. The next one is guidelines for selecting grading criteria. Based on Brown, it was about the first one is it is essential for all components of grading to be consistent with an institutional philosophy and or regulations. The second one is all components of final grade need to be explicitly stated in writing. The next one is challenge yourself to create checklists, chart, and note-taking system that allow you to convey to the student the basics for your conclusions. And the last one is consider allocating relative small weight. In the next slide, it's all about calculating grades. Based on this book, there are two grading. First one is about absolute grading, and the second one is about relative grading. Absolute grading is using pre-specified standard of performance on a numerical point system. Meanwhile, the relative grading is usually accomplished by ranking students in order of performance and assigning cut-off points for grades. Well, next one is about teacher perceptions of appropriate grade distributions. Most teachers bring to a test and a course evaluations an interpretation of estimated appropriate distributions. Follow that interpretations and make minor adjustments to compensate for such a matter as unexpected difficulty. This prevailing attitude toward a relative grading system is well accepted and uncontroversial. The next slide is about institutional expectation and constraints. Some institutions refuse to employ either grade or a numerical system of evaluation and instead offer narrative evaluations of a student. This preference for more individualized evaluation is often reactions to the upper generalizations of letter and numerical grading. Being cognizant of an institutional philosophy of grading is an important step toward a consistent and fair evaluation of the student. For example, if you are a new teacher in your institutions, try to determine what is grading philosophy is. Sometimes it is not explicit. The assumption is simply made that the teachers will grade the students using a system that conforms to an unwritten philosophy. This has potentially harmful backwards for the student. A teacher in an organization who applies a markedly target grading policy than other teachers is likely to be viewed by a student as being out of touch with the rest of the faculty. The result could be avoidance of the class and even mistrust on the part of the student. Conversely, an easy teacher may become a popular teacher, not because of what students learn, but because students know they will get a good grade. At least that's what Brown say. Okay, the next slide is cross-culture, pictures, and question of difficulty. The teachers, even in these cases, it is important to understand the context in which they are teaching. A number of variables bear on the issue in many cultures, such as It is unheard of to ask the student to self-assessment performance. The teacher assigns a grade and nobody questions the teacher criteria. The measure of a good teacher is one who can design a test that is so difficult that no student could achieve a perfect score. As a corollary, grades are reserved for highly selected few, and students are delighted with BS. One single final examination is the accepted determine of the student's entire course grade. As we bear in mind this and other cross-cultural constraints on philosophy of grading and evaluation, it is important to construct our own philosophy. This is an extra sensitive issue for teachers from English-speaking countries who take teaching position in other countries. In such a case, if we are guests in that country and it helps we tread lightly in our zeal for opportuning centuries of educational traditions, so don't do that. However, if we wish to do so, we can be an agent for change, but do so tactfully and sensitively, or you may find yourself on the first flight home. Well, the next one is about that do letter grades mean. Typically, institutional manual for teachers and students will list the following descriptions of the letter grades, such as excellent, good, adequate, inadequate, and failing. The upper generalization implied in letter grading underscore the meaninglessness of the adjectives typically cited as descriptions of those letters. And yet, those letters come to mean almost everything in their gatekeeping role in admissions, decisions, and employment acceptance. Educators everywhere must work to persuade the gatekeepers of the world. Not letter or numerical evaluations are simply one side of complex representation of student ability. Maybe I thought that's all I can explain based on my understanding from this material. Well, the next material will be presented by the next presenter.
Okay, I would like to explain about alternatives to letter grading. Gamification, live feedback, ungrading, a continuous climate of assessment, standard-based reporting. So what now? Metacognitive action, reflection, narrative, or anecdote, digital photographs, pass, fail, or monitor collaboration, non-point based rubric publish. For assessment of test, paper, report, extra class, exercise, or other formal score, task primary objective of which is to offer formative feedback, the possibilities beyond a simple number of letter includes. A teacher, nominal and or in comment. A teacher's written direction to students, self-assessment of performance. A teacher's review of the test in the next class period. Peer assessment of performance. Self-assessment of performance. A teacher conference with the student. For summative assessment of student at the end of course, those same additional assessment can be made perhaps in motivate form. A teacher's marginal and or an exam paper project comments. The teacher's motive written evaluative remarks on journal, portfolio, or other thingible. A teacher written reaction to a student's self-assessment or performance in a course. A completed summative checklist of competencies with comment. Narrative evaluations of general performance on K objective. A teacher's conference with the student. Appeal of the summative alternatives to grading particularly. 1. Self-assessment. 2. Narrative evaluation. 3. Checklists. 4. And conferences. Some principles and guidelines for grading and evaluation. Grading is not necessarily based on universally accepted scale. Grading is sometimes subjective and context dependent. Grading of tests is often done on the curve. Grade reflects teachers' philosophy of grading. Grades reflect a national philosophy of grading. Cross-cultural variance in grading philosophies need to be understood. Grades often conform by design to teacher expected distribution of students across a continuum. Tests do not always yield an expected level of difficulty. Later grade may not mean the same thing to all people, and alternative to grades or numerical scores are highly desirable as additional indicators of achievement. Principal guidelines should help you be an effective grader and evaluator of student performance. Develop an informed, comprehensive personal philosophy of grading that is consistent with your philosophy of teaching and evaluation. A certain an institution philosophy or grading and unless otherwise instituted. Conform to that philosophy or so that you are not outstepped with others. Design tests that conform to appropriate institutional and cultural expectation of the difficulty that students should experience. Or select appropriate criteria for grading and their relative weighting in calculating grade. 5. Communication criteria for grading students as beginning of other course and subsequent grading period or midterm final. 6. Triangulate later grade evaluation with alternative dates are more formative dates give more WASP. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.